from liberal elements within Congress.
Well, I mean, yeah, Obama also issued a number of executive orders early on in his administration. So what is so particular about this particular travel ban, this immigration order? And as we were talking about, like, is it different from other travel bans or immigration bans in U.S. history?
So let's look at the history of that. It's fascinating. I mean, the U.S. was effectively founded as a Protestant republic. And American policymakers have always been concerned about undermining this identity of the republic. So for all this talk of separation of church and state, the idea at the onset, which is still shared by a good number of Americans today, is that this is a white Protestant country. Now, in efforts to keep the country white, in efforts to keep the country Protestant, the U.S. over time would enact a variety of different legislations. Some of the more popular ones, famous or infamous, are, so 1882, for example. 1882, there's effectively a ban on Chinese immigration. Mm-hmm. So that's that same year, 1882, there's also a ban on and I'm not kidding you, on admitting convicts, lunatics, and idiots. Mm-hmm. There's actually a law that says that. And
not good company.
No, exactly. And good thing it's no longer affected, because otherwise I might have a problem with my whole immigration status. For the record, I'm neither a lunatic or a convict. But yeah, so we had this ban. We had this ban. So on immigration from China, which effectively lasted until 1943. Until World War II, at which point China becomes an ally of the U.S. and as a favor, we end the ban. So we had that element. In 1901, following McKinley's assassination by the son of Polish immigrants, we have an act put in place to deal with anarchists that effectively bans anarchists from entering the country.
How do we know someone's an anarchist?
I don't know. In all honesty, though, when I filled out my immigration papers, I had, have you ever, the communist question was on there. So they asked me if I'd committed crimes, and then they asked me if I've ever belonged to the Communist Party. I think there's something about the Nazi Party, but affiliation. Yes.
Are you a lunatic or an idiot?
I don't remember that being asked. The idiot question again, I would have grappled with, but it didn't come up. But so there's that history of trying to exclude others. So in the 20s, in 1921 and then in 1924, new legislation is introduced to really limit the number of people coming in from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe. There's effectively a ban imposed on migrants from East Asia, from South Asia, and from the Arab world. And it was all part of this effort to protect America's Western identity, America's Western civilization.
Yeah.
And it was very clear discrimination on the basis of nationality. And in the 20s, effectively, what Americans are seeking to exclude, or who Americans are seeking to exclude, it's effectively Eastern Europeans who are coming in larger and larger numbers, and Jews also. And that's, again, now we know, well, we shouldn't have done this, because Jews would actually pay a price for this during World War II. And so yeah, all of these things need to be put into proper perspective.
Okay. All right. Well, that's really fascinating to hear about the background of the orders as well as the history of immigration bans. All right. Well, thank you, Pierre. And stay tuned. We're going to continue this conversation with Professor Pierre Asselin. You're watching Global Connections.
Hey, has your signal just been taken over, or am I supposed to be here? This is Andrew, the security guy, your co-host on Hibachi Talk. Please join us every Friday on Think Tech Hawaii.
Aloha, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pauline Shakmakjian. I'm the host for a new show on Think Tech Hawaii called Outside In. Outside In will be taking a look at how the external world can help shape Hawaii's future. And I will be starting the show hopefully next year in terms of regularly scheduled programming. And we hope to invite a wide variety of different guests ranging from history, philosophy, art and architectural fields, all the way to robotics, biotech, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and the like. So we're going to have a full range of guests to cover many different areas of interest. And I hope to see you next year. Until then, aloha.
Aloha, welcome back to Global Connections. I'm your host, Grace Cheng, joined here by Pierre Aslan, Professor of History at Hawaii Pacific University. And we're talking about travel bans in U.S. history. And before the break, Pierre, you were talking about early 20th century travel bans, well, beginning with the late 19th century ban on Chinese immigrants, then the early 20th century against East European, East Asian, South Asians, Arabs as well. So, you know, our immigration in recent decades has been much more open. And a lot of this is in the context of like the anti-discrimination policies, laws that have been passed since the 60s in the context of the civil rights. So give us a little background on this.
You know, again, American immigration policy was very kind of unfavorable toward non-white Protestants, non-whites and non-Protestants. And during the Cold War, this becomes a liability for the United States, just like the treatment of blacks is a liability. So because Soviet propaganda is going to exploit these aspects, right? Because I mean, each country, the Soviet Union, the U.S., claims to be promoting justice, freedom, and so on and so forth. However, we chose to see the Soviets, and they saw us at the time. But what the Soviets end up doing is looking at Americans and say, okay, Americans say they're for democracy, look how they treat their blacks. Americans say that they're about freedom, look how they restrict immigration from outside. And so this creates tremendous pressure on American presidents to kind of change things. So what do we see? 64 Civil Rights Act, right? Of course, it's a response to domestic efforts at changing legislation. But there's also that external component that tends to be ignored, the Cold War context, which added more pressure on U.S. policymakers to change things, to kind of undermine Soviet propaganda to the effect that the U.S. is racist.
Because we need allies in the world versus
including
the Soviet.
in Africa.
Africa,
that was the thing.
Asia.
So what kind of message are you sending when you're trying to win over newly independent African states and blacks in the U.S. are getting lynched? They can't use bathrooms because whites are using them. So this was a really powerful tool used by the Soviets against the U.S. And so the Civil Rights Act, again, all the credit goes to the Kings and the Malcolm X's and the others who were involved in that struggle. But let's not forget that the Cold War context also created another pressure on policymakers to change. And this is what's interesting. So 64 Civil Rights Act, a year later, in 65, the U.S. under Johnson again revises this immigration policy and effectively at that point says, we will no longer discriminate on the basis of nationality, and so it's intended to kind of change America's image in the world. There are still quotas on the number of people who can come in, but you can't say that now we're going to allow 100,000 people who are white to come in, but no Arabs to come in. As of 65, you can no longer do that, discriminate on the basis of nationality, and that's the conflict we have right now. So the Trump White House is saying that the 52 provision gives the president the right to exclude people if they're detrimental to the U.S.
If he deems
it, right?
Himself. Okay.
But then 65 says you have that right, but you cannot discriminate on the basis of nationality. Right? Nationality means citizenship, right? So you can't say if you hold let's say a Syrian passport, you can't come in. Because the 65 Act was effectively meant to end these kinds of practices. And the Supreme Court has felt kind of, the courts in the U.S. have felt compelled to kind of uphold that because it becomes a slippery slope if you kind of decide to go against tradition and say, well, you know, because circumstances warrant, we're going to have these blanket bans on individuals.
Well, he claims that there are reasons for the ban on people from those 6 specific countries. Right?
Now, here's the thing that's interesting. There actually has been a Muslim ban before. 1980, Jimmy Carter. in the aftermath of the hostage crisis, Carter, right, the darling of liberals, it actually imposed a ban on all Iranians coming into the United States.
Yeah, but that's not Muslims. That's
Well,
Irene. It's
but
on
I
a
mean, right,
specific nationality.
in terms of the idea that, you know, if we look at what's happening now as a Muslim ban, right? White House says, no, it's a ban against people from Iraq, from
Right.
Syria, Yemen, you know,
Iraq.
irrespective of religion, right? But you know, critics say it's a Muslim ban. Well, there was this ban imposed by Carter in 1980 that so what it did was, it's interesting what it did. It basically nullified all visas that had been issued to Iranians who hadn't entered the country just yet.
Yeah.
So
But I mean, it doesn't seem the same thing. I mean, I think it, you know, we can, you know, one of the criticisms of these courts that have blocked the two immigration orders is that, you know, it reads into them that these are Muslim bans when they are bans against 6 specific countries, not people of, you know, the Muslim faith broadly. And so, you know, they're reading into what President Trump has said in other form, you know, as a candidate in particular, about that he would, you know, ban Muslims, we shouldn't allow Muslims in. But, you know, that this is not a blanket ban against Muslims. I mean, the one, so I think, you know, this one is, we could read it that way. It's 6 specific countries. And I think the question is, like, what is it about people from these specific countries that we should have a blanket ban over? I mean, the one that Carter issued in the context of the hostage crisis in Iran was part of a broader set of policies to pressure Iran itself. It wasn't specific to like an idea of like everybody from that country is a security threat. It was part of a diplomatic tool used to pressure Iran to deal with the 444 Americans that were being held hostage, or the
444
days, right? Yeah, it's such an easy number to remember.
So, but at the same time, right? The ban is imposed on revolutionary Iran, on the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, I see your point. I mean, but there is at the same time in what Carter is doing by imposing this blanket ban, kind of a clear message being sent to radical Islamists, right? And to the same extent that not all Iranians were buying into the revolution, right? Just as not all Muslims obviously are buying into ISIS and that kind of. Carter still felt that all Iranians ought to be banned.
So the other difference, I think, is that in the Iran case, in the aftermath of the Revolution in '79, there was a specific crisis with regard to Iran and the United States. In the current case, there's no direct crisis between or anything that's unusual anyway between the 6 countries in the United States.
So and I agree. I mean, again, when you look at the 50s, when you look at the Cold War, very clearly by the early 1950s, the Soviet Union, communism, is recognized widely as the enemy of the United States, right? So it's not just that, it's the entire system, the entire ideology, the entire country, the entire socialist camp is seen as hostile to the U.S. And technically the Americans at a point, because after all, communism, self-professed, right, is intent on eradicating capitalism as it's the root of all evil, and so it becomes part of this existential struggle. What we have here is slightly different. I mean, we have a situation where, you have bad apples in the area, a ton of people who desperately need help. And by saying that, well, all of them are banned, there's an element of unfairness here. I mean, refugees, people living in war zones trying to survive, desperately need the assistance of other countries. And for a country like the U.S., to come and say, well, if you're from Syria, too bad, blanket ban on you guys, it sends the wrong message. I mean, we want to make this country great again. We want this country to lead the world. When you lead the world, ultimately, you have to lead by example.